It's been 11 years since the world has had to endure the last deadly flu pandemic. On April 15th of 2009, the first case was detected of a human infected with a new virus, H1N1. The H1N1 virus contained a unique combination of influenza genes not previously identified in animals or people. The virus's genes were a combination of those most closely related to two separate swine lineages of influenza viruses. For this reason, the H1N1 flu virus became known as the swine flu. The initial case was detected in California, and 2 days later, a second case of the virus was detected approximately 130 miles away from the location of the first case. There were no known connections between the two patients. The virus soon began to spread rapidly across the U.S. and then throughout the world. By June 11th of 2009, the World Health Organization officially declared the start of the first flu pandemic in over 40 years, an avian influenza A virus H3N2 in 1968. The H1N1 virus was officially undeclared a pandemic in August of 2010 once it was contained through treatment and vaccines. Still, the virus comes back as a seasonal flu every year, but is not deadly like it was back when we first detected it and knew almost nothing about it. Humans are no strangers to experiencing these sudden and deadly viruses that cause worldwide catastrophes. Although we can't cover them all in one video here today, I have chosen 4 of the most deadly pandemics in history to dive into, and maybe shed some light on what caused these invisible killers and what we did to defeat them before. In February of 1957, reported cases of a new influenza A virus, H2N2, emerged in a province in southwest China, Guizhou, with Singapore reporting similar cases around the same time. Following the Spanish flu of 1918, which we will be discussing later on in this video, influenza outbreaks went back to their normal patterns of far less deadly regional epidemics in the 1930s, 40s, and early 50s. This may explain why the medical community, including the World Health Organization, missed the signs that this virus was a potential pandemic-causing strain of influenza initially. It wasn't until April 17th of 1957 that the virus caught the attention of American microbiologist Maurice Heilmann. He realized that the possibility of a pandemic-level influenza outbreak may be on its way to the U.S. and other regions around the world after reading a report published that day by the New York Times. The report detailed an epidemic occurring in Hong Kong that involved 250,000 people becoming infected over a short period of time. Acting quickly, Heilmann sent out cables to an Army Medical General Laboratory in Japan, asking the staff to investigate what was going on in Hong Kong. A medical officer identified a member of the U.S. Navy who'd become infected in Hong Kong and sent the serviceman's saliva back to Heilmann in the United States so that he could study the virus. Heilmann was the acting chief of respiratory diseases at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research in Washington, D.C., and he had access to large numbers of serum obtained from people at various ages through previous years and decades. By comparing the Navy serviceman's virus against previous flu viruses, he observed that the 2 key proteins in the flu virus underwent slight changes or drifts between seasons. This insight helped him later predict the need for yearly flu vaccinations. Research indicated that this virus was a mixed species strain originating from strains of avian influenza and human influenza viruses. While Heilmann and other experts worked on a vaccine, the virus spread to regions outside of Asia, including the UK and the US. By mid to late June, cases were starting to be reported, but the number of infections seemed relatively small at the time. It wasn't until the end of summer break, when kids started returning to school, that a wave of infections started being reported due to the children passing it amongst each other and then taking the viruses home to their families. The H2N2 virus was most lethal amongst children, the elderly, and pregnant women, like many others. Certain instances, though, such as vaccines taken and natural immunities over time, played a role in creating particular demographics of people less susceptible to the evolved virus strains than others. Luckily, Heilman and his team calculated their predictions of when the virus would likely explode into pandemic levels of infections correctly, and they made an effort to get the vaccine ready and available to the public. By the time the outbreak was beginning to peak in late September, the vaccine was being made available to the public and the spread of the virus began to slow. By March of 1958, the H2N2 influenza was no longer considered a pandemic-level threat and was phased out into becoming merely a part of the regular wave of seasonal flu. The virus, which was dubbed the Asian flu, killed an estimated 70,000 Americans and approximately 1.1 million people worldwide, but experts suggest that it would have killed many more if not for the timing and effectiveness of Heilman's vaccine. Under the reign of Marcus Aurelius, a plague known as the Plague of Galen lasted from around 165 to 180 CE. Unfortunately, this would only be the plague's first phase. Discussions and debates between the Romans at the time over how the plague was released onto the empire were vast. Most agreed, though, that this outbreak was likely to have been brought to the Roman Empire by troops of the Roman military returning from their campaign of the seas of Seleucia, a major city on the Tigris River. But there were two tales at the time that became popular when everyone was piecing together the details of the events. According to Ancient History Encyclopedia, in the first story, the Roman general, a later co-emperor, Lucius Verus, opened a closed tomb in Seleucia during the subsequential sacking of the city, thus releasing the disease. The tale suggests that the epidemic was a punishment as the Romans violated an oath to the gods not to pillage the city. In the second story, a Roman soldier opened a golden casket in the temple of Apollo in Babylon following the plague to escape. Two different 4th century sources ascribe the outbreak to participating in a sacrilege, violating the sanctuary of a god and breaking the oath. Other Romans blamed Christians for making the gods angry, precipitating the outbreak. The second outbreak occurred in 251 to 266 CE, compounding the effects of the earlier outbreak. The Roman historian Dio Cassius estimated that there were approximately 2,000 deaths per day in Rome at the height of the outbreak. In the second outbreak, the estimate of the rate of death was much higher, upwards of 5,000 per day. It has been suggested that 10% of the entire world's population perished. The number of global fatalities most agreed on by historians is approximately 5 million. Another statistic agreed upon by historians is the belief that a quarter to a third of the entire population of the Roman Empire died from the Antonine Plague. Some historians also suggest that the plague may represent a useful starting point for understanding the beginning of the decline of the Roman Empire in the West and ultimately its inevitable fall. Historians suspect the plague to have either been smallpox or measles, but the true cause has no definitive answer. We can conclude with high certainty that the reason the plague's sweeping havoc ceased was because of the devastating amount of deaths it accumulated during its outbreak, succeeding in plummeting the population, with the economy plummeting soon after. In October of 1347, 12 ships emerged from the Black Sea and docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. Onlookers made their way to greet the unexpected travelers. Once aboard, they were met with a horrifying discovery. Most of the sailors on the ships were dead, and those that were still alive were gravely ill with black boils that oozed blood and pus covering their skin. Sicilian authorities quickly ordered the fleet of death ships out of the harbor, but it was too late. Over the next 5 years, what became known as the Black Death would kill more than 20 million people in Europe alone, almost 1/3 of the continent's population. Oddly enough, even before the so-called death ships pulled into the port at Messina, many Europeans had heard rumors about a great pestilence that was engraving a deadly path across the trade routes of the Near and Far East. The rumors would soon come to light as truth when they learned that just a few years prior, the disease had struck China, India, Persia, Syria, and Egypt. The horrendous disease was vicious in all its wrath, as the Europeans were ill-equipped to combat such a plague. The symptoms were far from mild. Boils such as those witnessed on the sailors previously mentioned not only grew darker in color with oozy pus and blood, they were also known to range in sizes, some becoming as large as an apple. These unsightly swellings were accompanied by a slew of other symptoms, including fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, and terrible aches and pains. It started with an attack on the lymphatic system, causing swelling in the lymph nodes. When left untreated, the plague's infection spread to the blood, lungs, or both, usually resulting in death rather soon after. Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio documented his personal witnessing of the plague. He described the Black Death as terrifyingly, indiscriminately contagious. He wrote, "The mere touching of the clothes appeared to itself communicate the malady to the toucher. The disease was also horrifyingly efficient in some. People who were perfectly healthy when they went to bed at night could be dead by morning." French biologist Alexander Yersin detected what scientists today understand to be what the plague was spread by. Yersin discovered a particular form of bacillus at the end of the 19th century. The bacillus travels from person to person through the air, as well as through the bite of infected fleas and rats, both of which could be found almost anywhere in medieval Europe, and were well known to make their home aboard ships of all kinds, which is how the deadly plague made its way through one European port city after another. The Black Death was eventually spread to a port in France, and then in North Africa. It then reached Rome and Florence, two cities at the center of a web of popular trade routes. By the middle of 1348, the Black Death had struck Paris, Bordeaux, Lyon, and London. Knowing what we know today, this series of events seems comprehensible given the circumstances at the time that the plague was at its peak. But in the middle of the 14th century, as it was happening, no one knew exactly how the Black Death was transmitted from one person to another. There was even less known about how to prevent or treat it. According to one doctor at the time, for example, instantaneous death occurs when the aerial spirit escaping from the eyes of a sick man strikes the healthy person standing near and looking at the sick. Dangerous and unsanitary techniques such as bloodletting and boil lancing, as well as superstitious practices such as burning aromatic herbs and bathing in rose water or vinegar, were the typical attempts physicians at the time used for treatment. Meanwhile, panic became the default reaction, while healthy people did all they could to avoid the sick. Doctors refused to see patients, priests refused to administer last rites, and shopkeepers closed their stores. Many people fled the cities for the countryside, but even there they could not escape the disease, since it was also affecting cows, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens. Many people, desperate to save themselves, even started to abandon their sick and dying loved ones. The plague seemed never ending. Even when it was seeming to slow its spread, it returned with a vengeance years later. Eventually, officials in the Venetian-controlled port city of Ragusa were able to slow its spread by keeping arriving sailors in isolation until it was clear they were not carrying the disease. The Black Death is estimated to have killed 30% to 60% of Europe's population. Deaths attributed to this plague globally are estimated to be between 75 and 200 million. In total, the plague may have reduced the world's population from an estimated 475 million to between 350 to 375 million in the 14th century. It took over 200 years for Europe's population to recover to its previous level, and some regions, such as Florence, did not recover until the 19th century. The Black Death pandemic had almost run its course by the early 1350s, but the plague reappeared every few generations for centuries. Modern sanitation and public health practices may have greatly mitigated the impact of the disease, but surprisingly has not eliminated it. Antibiotics are still available to treat the Black Death, but according to the World Health Organization, there are still 1,000 to 3,000 cases of the plague reported yearly to this day. World War I was arguably one of the most deadly conflicts in history. On July 28, 1914, a month to the day after the assassination of the heir to the Austria-Hungarian throne, Franz Ferdinand triggered a series of diplomatic maneuverings among European powers. After a decade of confrontation and growing tensions between the two, European alliances quickly became undoubtedly solidified. Seizing on the assassination of Ferdinand as a pretext, Austria-Hungary delivered an ultimatum containing unacceptable demands to rival power Serbia on July 23rd. Many European diplomats scrambled to defuse the situation, but by July 25th, Serbia and Austria-Hungary were both reassured support by two other European powers. Russia was willing to back Serbia, and Germany was ready to assist Austria-Hungary. Serbia refused to comply with the former demands with no interest in negotiation. In return, Austria-Hungary rejected the response and began laying the groundwork out for war. Pre-mobilized Austria-Hungary troops awaited possible signals from Serbia that they may compromise and hand Austria-Hungary a diplomatic victory while maintaining Serbian sovereignty. The signal never came, and the next 3 days were highly eventful, with everyone involved feeling the tension coming to a head. By July 24th, war was officially declared. The feud between Austria-Hungary and Serbia led to the first actual war the entire world would eventually somehow be involved in. Many countries worldwide remained neutral, but there was not a single populated continent that didn't have countries involved in some way at some point before it ended on November 11, 1918. The results were of course devastating given the high number of casualties the war created in a little over 4 years of battle. But the amount of lives taken by military action and war crimes paled in comparison to the unforeseen silent killer with no allegiance to anyone at all. 7 months before the war would come to an end, after 3 years of the entire world being at war internationally, this killer appeared in disguise and quickly transformed into an aggressive, fast-spreading force that not even the most elite militaries had prepared for. Outbreaks of flu-like illnesses were being detected in March of 2018 in the United States. More than 100 soldiers at Camp Funston in Fort Riley, Kansas, became ill with flu, and within a week the number of flu cases multiplied by up to 4 times. Sporadic flu activity spreads unevenly throughout the United States, Europe, and possibly Asia for over the next 6 months. The first mention of a new influenza appears in an April 5th weekly public health report. The report informs officials of 18 severe cases and 3 deaths in Haskell, Kansas. By October, over 195,000 people in the U.S. in October alone died from the virus. The virus was an unfamiliar strain of influenza, eventually known as the Spanish flu, causing a global pandemic, spreading rapidly and killing indiscriminately. The so-called Spanish flu didn't originate in Spain, but with Spain's neutral stance in the war, they were one of the most trusted sources in the worldwide media on the issue and earned an organic trust in reporting on the pandemic honestly to the world. In turn, the world's widely given name became the Spanish flu. With the world at war, the United States, who had long stayed out of the conflict, entered into the battle on April 6, 1917. Troops worldwide were becoming infected with this deadly disease as country citizens also battled the devastation of the virus at home. Once the war ended on November 11, 1918, and the demobilization of militaries were sending soldiers home, a second wave of the deadly flu virus occurred, killing even more at a higher rate than the initial wave did. The unforgiving virus was not only deadly, but highly unusual in who it targeted the most lethally. The less confusing statistic is that it was harsh on children under the age of 5 and in seniors over 75. But this flu was unique in who its main deadly target was: young adults between the ages of 20 and 30 who had previously been healthy suffered the highest mortality rate from it. There were 3 different waves of illnesses during the pandemic, starting in March of 1918 and subsiding by summer of 1919. The pandemic peaked in the U.S. during the second wave in the fall of 1918. This highly fatal second wave was responsible for most of the U.S.'s deaths attributed to the pandemic. An estimated 1/3 of the world's population was infected with the 1918 flu virus, resulting in at least 50 million deaths worldwide, some reports claiming upwards of 100 million. A third wave of the illness occurred during the winter of 1919 and the spring of 1920, adding to the pandemic death toll. The third wave of the pandemic subsided during the summer of 1919. Eventually, the pandemic spread slowed enough to no longer be considered a pandemic, but the H1N1 virus continued to circulate seasonally for the next 38 years, until the H2N2 virus emerged in 1957, triggering another pandemic replacing the 1918 virus. With no vaccine to protect against infection and no antibiotics to treat secondary bacterial infections that could be associated with influenza infections, control efforts worldwide were limited to non-pharmaceutical interventions such as isolation, quarantine, good personal hygiene, use of disinfectants, and limitations of public gatherings, which were applied unevenly. Since the 1918 outbreak devastated the globe, scientists have conducted endless studies and experiments to figure out how certain public mandates put into place compared to others and how it all helped to hurt or slow the spread. One study which compared 2 major U.S. cities and the way that they handled the situation shed some light on the obvious decisions that hurt and helped the problem: Philadelphia and St. Louis. Philadelphia detected its first case of this influenza on September 17, 1918. The next day, in an attempt to halt the virus spread, city officials launched a campaign against coughing, spitting, and sneezing in public, thinking that would slow the virus's spread. 10 days later, the city hosted a parade that 200,000 people attended. Shortly after health measures were put into place in Philadelphia, a case popped up in St. Louis. 2 days later, the city shut down most public gatherings and quarantined victims in their homes. The cases slowed. But by the end of the pandemic, more than 500,000 people in America alone had passed. But the death rate in St. Louis was less than half of the rate in Philadelphia. During the first 6 months of the pandemic, deaths due to the virus were estimated to be about 358 people per 100,000 in St. Louis, compared to around 748 per 100,000 in Philadelphia. Dramatic demographic shifts in the past century have made containing a pandemic increasingly difficult. The rise of globalization and larger, more densely populated cities becoming the norm can facilitate a virus's spread across a continent in as little as a few hours. While the tools available to respond have remained nearly the same, now and then public health interventions are the first line of defense against an epidemic or pandemic in the absence of a vaccine. These measures include closing schools, shops, and restaurants, placing restrictions on transportation, mandating social distancing, and banning public gatherings. Our current situation may feel daunting with no ending in sight, but we have learned from the past and there is always a means to an end. The rate at which we get there is up to us and our universal efforts to do so.